Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. Sarah had always felt uneasy in her apartment, but she never could quite place why. It wasn't the building itself. It was old, yes, but sturdy, and in a quiet neighborhood. The neighbors were friendly, and the hallways were always clean. Yet, something about the place made her skin crawl, especially when the sun began to set. It started subtle. The first few nights, Sarah would notice a figure standing by her window. Just a shadow, she thought at first, maybe a trick of the light, or her mind playing games. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, more distinct. Every evening, around 9 p.m., she would catch a glimpse of something standing there, at first just a silhouette, and then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light of her living room, she could make out the figure more clearly. It was a man, standing motionless by the window, staring out into the street. The first time she saw him, she thought he was just someone walking by, maybe pausing to look at something outside. But then she realized he was there every night at the same time, every single evening, like clockwork, standing there staring out of the window with his head slightly tilted down, his hands at his sides. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it. After all, it could have been anyone, right? It wasn't uncommon for people to stop and look out the window from time to time. But the longer this went on, the more unsettling it became. There was something about his stillness that didn't feel right. Something about the way he never moved. Never turned, as if he was waiting for something. One night, after a long day at work, Sarah returned home later than usual. It was already dark outside, and the apartment was eerily quiet. She tossed her keys onto the kitchen counter, feeling an odd chill in the air. Though the heat was on, she paused, looking at the living room window. There was a light mist outside, and she could faintly see the silhouette of the figure standing by the window. She froze. Something was wrong. It wasn't just that he was standing there. It was the fact that Sarah hadn't seen him approach. The street outside her window was empty. No cars, no people, just the mist swirling in the streetlights. How had he gotten there so silently? How long had he been standing there, staring into her apartment? Her heart raced. She instinctively grabbed her phone and texted her friend, Rachel, asking if she could come over. It was an odd request, and Rachel texted back immediately, asking if everything was okay. Sarah didn't want to explain the unease she felt, but there was no denying it. Something about this man, this watcher, was unsettling her to her core. She turned the lights off in the living room, hoping that if he saw she was home, he might leave. But when she peeked through the blinds again, he was still there, unmoving, his shadow stretching eerily across the street. He's watching me, she whispered to herself. Her fingers trembled as she typed a quick message to Rachel. I think someone's been watching me through the window. Please come over. Seconds felt like minutes as she waited, pacing in the kitchen. The sound of her heartbeat drowned out the normal evening sounds. There was nothing, just the haunting stillness. She checked the time. 9:10 p.m. Exactly when it happened every night. She wasn't imagining it then. Just as the first wave of panic was rising in her chest, something changed. The figure shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head turned toward her window. Slowly enough that Sarah knew he couldn't have just noticed her. He had been watching her for a while. He had seen her, and now He knew she was aware of him. Her stomach churned as she stepped back from the window. She didn't dare look away. The figure's face was still obscured by the angle, but she could see enough. The chilling outline of a person, his features dark, with no movement except the steady, deliberate turn of his head toward her. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, closing the distance between him and the window. Sarah backed away, holding her breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and she jumped, quickly glancing at Thea. "Scream," Rachel had responded. But Sarah couldn't look away from the figure now standing almost at her window. It was as if the man knew she was watching him, knew she was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or breathe. And then, in the silence of the apartment, she heard it, quiet at first, but unmistakable. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window. The man hadn't moved. She hadn't moved. The sound of tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if the figure was desperately trying to get her attention. Sarah's mind raced. There was no logical explanation for this. No reason why someone would be at her window, tapping like this, so persistently. The room felt colder. The temperature dropped as though the air itself had become thick with tension. The tapping continued, slowly at first, but then faster, more frenzied, and with each tap, Sarah's heart seemed to beat in time, faster and faster. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room. The man had slammed his hand against the glass. The impact was so forceful that Sarah nearly screamed, and her phone fell from her hand. She stood frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. Her only thought was, "I need to leave. I need to get out of here." She ran to the door of here and yanked it open, the hallway beyond dark and silent. She bolted out of the apartment, her shoes slapping against the hallway floor as she sprinted down the stairs. She didn't stop until she was out on the street, looking back at her apartment, building in terror. But the man didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He had made his point, and the worst part, Sarah knew, without a doubt, that he would be there tomorrow. The watcher was always watching. Sarah stood on the street corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, closed, the streetlights casting their soft glow across the pavement. But there was an overwhelming silence. The watcher was gone. Or so it seemed. But she knew better than to trust the calm. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, breaking the stillness. She fumbled for it with trembling hands, almost dropping it as she tried to pull it out. It was Rachel. "Sarah? What happened? I'm on my way now, don't worry." Her heart leapt in her chest. "Hurry," she typed back. "I think he's still out there, watching. Please, hurry." She took a few steps back, instinctively looking up at her apartment window once more. The unease in her chest intensified, her eyes darting back and forth, searching for anything. But there was nothing, except the stillness of the night. Then she heard it again. Tap. Her eyes snapped toward the window. This time, it wasn't just a faint tap. It was louder, more forceful. A tap, followed by a long, slow drag, as if someone was running their fingers along the glass. Tap, 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 tap. Sarah's blood ran cold. She couldn't move. Her body locked in place, every muscle in her frozen by the sound that now filled the empty night. She turned her head slowly, her gaze fixed on her apartment. For a moment, she thought she might see a figure standing there, staring out at her, but the window was dark. There was nothing there. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. She had to leave. It was getting worse. She couldn't stay here anymore. Couldn't even stay on the street where she felt exposed. Yet, something deep inside her compelled her to look again, to verify what she couldn't bring herself to believe. She looked back at the apartment, squinting into the darkness. Then, through the blackness of the window, something moved, a shadow, slowly, unmistakably. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone was there. The figure was back, standing behind the glass, and then something else. The figure smiled. It wasn't a smile she had ever seen before. It was unnatural, wide, almost too wide, stretching across the face of the man who had haunted her for the past few days. His eyes were still hidden in shadow, but his smile was unmistakable. Sarah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away. His smile wide, knew she was watching. Her phone vibrated again, startling her. Rachel was calling. "Sarah, are you okay?" Rachel's voice was distant, worried. "I'm almost there. What happened?" Sarah couldn't answer. She couldn't find the words. She could barely breathe. The figure behind the window raised a hand, placing it on the glass slowly, deliberately, and then, as if trying to get closer, his face moved toward the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he exhaled softly. The mist in the window cleared, revealing his eyes, dark, empty eyes. Sarah felt the world spinning, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out of there. "I'm coming now. I'll be Pam." "All there soon," Rachel's voice echoed through the phone. But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't stop staring at the man on the other side of the glass. His hand pressed harder against the window. The glass creaked under the pressure, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off him. And then, just as Sarah opened her mouth to scream for help, the lights of her apartment flickered and went out. Everything was plunged into darkness. A cold rush of air swept through Sarah's body, and she felt rush of air swept through Sarah's body, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She could feel it deep in her bones, the feeling that something was coming for her. Something was about to happen. Her phone buzzed again, this time louder, as if trying to break through the fear that had gripped through the fear that had gripped her. She snapped her gaze back to the window. The figure was gone. Her phone kept ringing, and she finally snapped out of her daze, answering it in a shaky voice. She gasped. There was a brief silence, followed by an odd sound. It was a faint scratching, like nails against metal. Then Rachel's voice came through, her words strained and confused. "Sarah, I'm outside, but your lights just turned and..." Confused. On again. "I saw something move inside your apartment. Is someone with you?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Rachel's voice faltered, as if she were standing at the building, looking at the window. "No one is here with me," Sarah whispered. The scratching grew louder, more frantic suddenly. Sarah whispered. The scratching grew louder, more frantic suddenly. Sarah's phone went dead. The line went silent. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the air, louder than any sound. Then, the door behind her creaked open slowly. The watcher was inside. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Open behind her was followed by a cold, stagnant air brushing against her skin. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned slowly, her entire body frozen with fear. The room was dark. Save for the faint light of the street lamp, filtering through the window, she could feel the presence in the air, the unmistakable weight of someone standing behind her, someone who shouldn't be there. She had locked the door when she left earlier. She was sure of it. Her breath quickened. She didn't dare turn around. She couldn't bring herself to face whatever was in the room with her. The silence was maddening, stretched thin and tense, like a taut wire waiting to snap. She could hear a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against itself. It was the sound of movement. He was in the room with her, slowly stepping forward. The chilling cold air that had swept in when the door opened grew more intense, biting into her skin. Her mind raced for an explanation. It didn't make sense. How had he gotten in? Why wasn't he making a sound? And why was he so silent now? He had always tapped on the window, always moved deliberately. But now there was no sound, just the sense of his presence, closing in on her. Then the unmistakable sound of breathing, deep, steady, but slow. It echoed in the stillness of the apartment, as if the man was right behind her, hovering close enough to reach out and touch her at any moment. She could feel the chill creeping closer, her entire body tense with fear. She had to move. She had to move. She had to escape, but her feet were rooted to the floor. It felt like her legs weren't her own, like they were stuck in place, unwilling to move. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, and then the breathing stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was heavier, more suffocating. A thick, oppressive quiet that made Sarah's skin crawl. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against the back of her neck. She gasped, spinning around in one swift motion, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there. The room was empty. Nothing. She blinked in disbelief, feeling pulse pounding in her throat. Had it been a hallucination? A figment of her overactive imagination? A figment of her overactive imagination. But then, just as she began to convince herself that maybe she was losing her mind, she heard it again. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming closer, slowly, steadily. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door, her eyes desperately searching the darkness. Her phone was dead, no longer working, and she was completely alone in the apartment. She reached for the door, her hand shaking uncontrollably, and slowly turned the handle. Her eyes flicked back toward the empty room, expecting the figure to be there, to be watching her. But there was nothing, only the eerie quiet. The door creaked open, revealing the empty hallway, but something was wrong. The hallway, once familiar, now felt foreign. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air seemed colder than it had been before. The sense of dread that had settled into Sarah's bones flared into a wave of panic. She stepped back into the room, her pulse racing, and slammed the door behind her. She could hear her breath ragged, echoing in the otherwise silent apartment. She had to get out. She had to get out. She had to leave before it was too late. But just as she turned toward the window, her eyes locked onto something so small, so insignificant, that at first she couldn't understand what it was. There, on the window sill, was a single black feather. It glinted in the dim light, out of place, as if it had been placed there just moments ago. Her blood ran cold. She had no pets, no birds, no reason for it to be there. And then the lights flickered again. The door behind her creaked open once more. This time, the figure stepped inside, a shadow taller than any human should have been, draped in darkness. The same coldness that she had felt when the door had opened before. The same overwhelming presence. The watcher had come inside, and this time, he wasn't leaving. As the shadow moved toward her, Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. She was trapped, the walls closing in. There was nowhere to run then. In the deepest of silences, she heard a whisper, a voice low and raspy, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the voice, the man she had seen at her window every night. "I told you, Sarah, you can never escape me." And then the darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness enveloped her like a thick, suffocating blanket. Sarah gasped for air, but the air gasped for air. But the air seemed to grow heavier, as though it were no longer oxygen but something much colder, something otherworldly. The whisper of the figure's voice still echoed in her mind, reverberating off the walls like a haunting melody. You can never escape me. The words were seared into her thoughts, repeating, louder now, drowning out her own frantic breathing. She stumbled back against the wall, desperate to escape, to find an exit, any exit, but the apartment had changed. Familiar, comforting space had twisted into a nightmare. The floor seemed to stretch impossibly long, the walls narrowing as if they were closing in on her. She felt trapped, suffocated by the air, the space, the very feeling of being watched by something she could neither see nor outrun. Her heart pounded against her chest, each beat shaking her body. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt dry, paralyzed by terror. She could feel his presence, could hear the soft shuffling of footsteps getting closer and closer. The shadow loomed larger, its shape indistinguishable from the darkness around it. It was as though the shadow itself was the room, the apartment, and the person in front of her, all at once. Her vision blurred, and she fought the wave of dizziness threatening to consume her. The sound echoed through the room. She couldn't tell if it was coming from inside her head or if it was real. The tapping grew louder, as though it was coming from the window, but her eyes were fixed on the figure, now standing just inches away. It was closer than it had ever been before. Its eyes, dark and hollow, stared into hers with an unsettling emptiness. She took a shaky step back, bumping into the corner of the room. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized, too late, that there was nowhere left to retreat. And then it spoke again, a rasping, almost melodic sound that sent a chill crawling down her spine. You thought you could escape me, but I've always been here. Watching. Waiting, her mind reeled. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. It was just some twisted dream. A nightmare. She would wake up. She had to, but no matter, she would wake up. How hard she willed herself to wake up. The darkness pressed in, relentless and suffocating. The figure reached out a hand. The air around it shimmered, bending and distorting as if reality itself was warping. In response to its touch, Sarah felt the coldness of its fingers brush against her cheek, and she flinched away, her skin crawling with dread. The hand moved slowly, almost tenderly, as though savoring the fear it was provoking in her. She couldn't look away. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her mouth was dry, her throat choked with the weight of terror. The whisper returned. You can't run from me, Sarah. Not anymore. She tried to force herself to speak, to ask what it wanted, why it was doing this. But her voice failed her. The words stuck in her throat. She felt as though she were suffocating in the silence, in the cold, in the shadow of the figure standing over her. Then it happened. The room around her seemed to warp and twist in an agonizing motion. She was no longer in her apartment. The walls were gone, replaced by an endless, dark expanse. The coldness deepened, and an unnatural quiet filled the void. The figure was gone, but Sarah could feel its presence, looming just beyond the edge of her sight. She tried to scream, but the silence swallowed her whole. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, the smell of death and rotting leaves, like something long forgotten had been buried here for centuries. Where am I? She whispered to herself. Her voice, weak and hollow, seemed to fade into the emptiness. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, vague, shrouded in mist. Slowly, it came closer, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate pace. She walking toward her with a slow, deliberate pace, wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The more she tried to step back, the further she seemed to be from any kind of escape. As the figure drew closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the Watcher, his face distorted and hollow. a grotesque parody of what it once had been, grinned at her with the same empty, malicious smile that had haunted her since the beginning. She could see his mouth moving, his lips forming words, but no sound came from his mouth. Then the words appeared in her mind, loud and clear. "It's too late." Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. The world around her grew darker, colder, and her limbs began to tremble with exhaustion. She was trapped, lost in this place. She was trapped, lost in this place, and the Watcher had finally caught her. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't run. It was over. But just as the darkness seemed to swallow her whole, something shifted. A faint light flickered in the distance. So faint, it was barely visible against the sea of black. It pulsed once, twice, and then began to grow, pushing back the darkness around her. She turned toward the light, her body now able to move again, her steps shaky and slow. The Watcher's grin faltered for a moment, and his figure seemed to waver, as if the light was affecting him. The light grew brighter and brighter until it surrounded her completely. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah could breathe again. She reached out toward breathe again. She reached out toward the light, desperate, her hands trembling as they brushed against the warmth it emitted. She felt herself being pulled toward it, as if the light itself was drawing her in. And then the darkness screamed. But it was too late, consumed her, and the Watcher's form dissolved into the shadows. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was free, or so she thought as she stepped into the light. The ground beneath her feet gave way. As Sarah fell, the light surrounding her flickered and then dimmed, like a candle caught in a gust of wind. The darkness rushed up to meet her, cold and suffocating, pulling her deeper into a vast, empty void. She gasped for breath, but there was no air. No sense of breath, but there was no air. No sense of direction. No sensation at all except the weight of falling. The feeling of weightlessness persisted for what felt like an eternity. She was surrounded by nothing. No sound, no light, just endless darkness. The Watcher was gone, but the emptiness that replaced him was even more terrifying. It was as if everything she had known, everything she had feared, had been erased, leaving her alone in an unfeeling abyss. Suddenly, the sensation of falling stopped. Her feet touched solid ground. She opened her eyes, expecting to be in the same empty space, but instead, she found herself standing in an old, decrepit hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with cracked, peeling wallpaper. The smell of decay and abandonment filled her nose. She looked around, her heart racing. This wasn't her apartment. This wasn't anywhere she recognized. It was a place that felt wrong, like it had been forgotten by time, left behind in the dark corners of the world. Her breath caught in her throat. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, each way filled with darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of the faint light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. She hesitated, her legs stiff with fear. She turned her head, trying to decide which way to go, but before she could move, she heard it. A faint sound, distant but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate tap against the floor, echoing down the floor, echoing down the theory hallway. Then another, and another. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the sound of footsteps coming closer, steady and methodical. She couldn't see who or what was making the sound, but she could feel the weight of its presence. The footsteps grew louder, faster, tap, tap, tap. It was like the sound was closing in on her, and then she saw it, at the far end of the hallway, a figure emerging from the darkness. The figure emerging from the darkness. The figure was familiar. It was the Watcher, but something was different. His form was blurry, distorted, like a shadow that couldn't quite hold its shape. His face was obscured by darkness, but she could feel his gaze, locked onto her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Step, and the lights flickered violently. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, the distance between them growing larger and then smaller, as if the very space around her was warping, bending. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt frozen in place, unable to move or fight. The Watcher took another step forward, his movement slow, deliberate. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, each beat louder than the last. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her mouth was dry, her chest tightening with every breath. Step, step, step. He was closer now, just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. The darkness behind him seemed to grow. Swallowing everything in him seemed to grow. Swallowing everything in him. Its path. The wall seemed to close in, the hallway narrowing, leaving her with nowhere to go. The Watcher reached out a hand, his fingers stretching toward her, and she felt a chill run down her spine as the air around her grew colder. Hand was so close now that she could feel the heat of his breath on her skin. "You're mine," he whispered, his voice low and rasping, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. "You can never escape me." Her body shook, and for a moment, escape me. Her body shook, and for a moment, she thought she might faint, but then a surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him take her. With everything she had left, she forced her legs to move, stumbling backward toward the end of Oz, the hallway, away from him. She turned, running blindly, not knowing where she was going or what awaited her. The Watcher's footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder with every passing second. She turned a corner and found herself in another room. The door slammed shut behind her, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to catch her breath. But then the room grew cold. The walls started to close in, and she realized too late that there was no escape, no way out. The room was locked, sealed shut, and the Watcher was right behind her. Tap, tap, tap. He was right there, and then, from the corner of the room, she saw a figure, another person, a woman, standing motionless, her back turned to Sarah. "Help me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, frozen. Suddenly, the woman turned slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, empty.
"You're not alone," the woman said, her voice echoing. Echoing.
In Sarah's mind, her mouth not moving. None of us are. And in that moment, Sarah realized, the Watcher wasn't just after her. He had been waiting for someone else. Waiting for all of them. The Watcher had claimed his prize. And now, their Watcher had claimed his prize. Was no escape. Sarah staggered back, her heart pounding as the woman's hollow, emotionless eyes bore into her. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, and her limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. She couldn't move. The air around her thickened, suffocating, and for the briefest moment, she thought she might faint, but she couldn't. She had to stay awake. She had to fight. The woman in front of her remained motionless, her vacant gaze never leaving Sarah's face. There was something wrong with her. Her skin was too pale, her features too sharp, too unnerving, as though she wasn't truly human. She wasn't just standing there, though. Her presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. Darkness seeming to pool around her feet like ink spreading across a sheet of paper. "Who are you?" Sarah managed to whisper, her voice breaking. She didn't expect an answer. She wasn't sure she wanted one. The woman's lips parted, and Sarah froze for a moment. There was only silence thick and pregnant with fear. Then the words came, The words came, not from the woman's mouth, but in Sarah's mind. You think you can escape him? You think you can run? There is no escape. The voice was icy, impossibly cold, and it sent a chill crawling down Sarah's spine. The words weren't just spoken. They dripped with something ancient and dark, a sense of finality that made her knees buckle. Sarah wanted to scream, to push the woman away, but she couldn't move. She was trapped. Who is he? Sarah gasped, her voice trembling as she backed into the wall. Her heart thundered in her chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching, reaching toward her. The woman took a step forward, her gaze still locked on her. Sarah's? Her eyes were endless voids, hollow and dark. He is the one who watches? The words were soft but final, echoing through Sarah's skull like a death knell. He is the one who waits for the lost souls. He has always been here. He will always be here. The room seemed to grow colder still, the walls now closing in as though the very space around her was warping. Sarah gasped for breath, her lungs heavy with the weight of the air. Every instinct in her screamed for her to run, but there was no escape. The room was shrinking, and with each passing second, the Watcher's presence grew more suffocating. You were not the first to fall into his grip, Sarah, the woman continued. Her voice was colder now, almost mechanical. And you will not be the last. The Watcher. He had been watching her from the start, waiting for the right moment to claim her. He had been there when she moved into the apartment, lurking in the shadows, a silent observer, and now, she realized with horrifying clarity, she was nothing more than a pawn in his endless game. Suddenly, the figure of the Watcher appeared in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows. She hadn't seen him move, hadn't seen him approach, but there he was, his tall, dark form looming in the corner, his eyes hidden in shadow, his presence overwhelming. The room felt even colder now, and she could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. It's too late, Sarah, the Watcher's voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a shout, it was as if his voice was everywhere, surrounding her, echoing through her very thoughts. You belong to me now? Shook, but she refused to look away. She couldn't. She wouldn't let him see her fear. She had to find a way out. But there was nothing. No escape. The walls were closing in, the room growing darker and darker. The floor beneath her seemed to tremble, as though the entire world was shaking. Then, the figure of the woman in front of her stepped forward. She was no longer standing still. She moved with a strange fluidity, her movements unnaturally smooth. Her hand reached out toward Thierry Andres and Sarah, and the air grew even colder as her fingers grazed Sarah's cheek. The contact was electric, like ice against skin, and Sarah recoiled in shock, the sensation burning through her like fire. The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile. There is no escape from the Watcher. He's claimed you, Sarah, just as he claimed all the others. The room began to spin, the walls closing in on her, the darkness now almost suffocating. She could hear the sound of the Watcher's footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of his presence, and Sarah realized with horror that there was nothing she could do. She was trapped in a nightmare, with no end in sight. But then, just as the darkness seemed to completely consume her, something shifted, a light. Faint at first, like a distant star in the distance, but it grew, slowly, until it filled the room with a soft, warm glow. The Watcher paused, his form shifting in the shadows as the light grew brighter. The woman recoiled, her face twisted in confusion and fear. No. The light grew more intense, and Sarah felt the overwhelming darkness around her begin to recede, like the tide being pulled back by an unseen force. She reached out toward the light, her hand trembling. This was her chance. This was her escape. With a final surge of energy, Sarah ran toward the light. As she did, she felt the Watcher's presence pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the shadows, but she fought against it. She pushed forward, harder and harder, until suddenly everything stopped. The darkness was gone. The light surrounded her completely, and she felt free. Watcher, the woman, the apartment, all of it had faded away. Sarah was standing in the middle of a peaceful, quiet forest. She was no longer in that suffocating, dark room. The air was fresh, the ground beneath her feet soft, and the weight that had been pressing on her chest was gone. But as she looked around, a chill ran down her spine. In the distance, she could see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. The Watcher was still watching, and he was still waiting. Sarah still waiting. Heart raced as she stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the figure in the distance. The peaceful forest around her, the fresh air that had once felt so liberating, now seemed suffocating. The figure wasn't moving, but Sarah could feel its gaze on her, as if the Watcher had never truly let her go. Her breathing grew shallow as she took a hesitant step backward. The ground beneath her feet felt unnervingly solid, but something in the air was shifting again. The sense of calm she had felt just moments ago was slipping away, replaced by the familiar unease that had followed her for so long. The figure didn't move, yet Sarah could feel its presence growing stronger, closer. The trees around her seemed to close in, their once welcoming branches now looming over her, like dark sentinels. The wind began to pick up, and the once still forest came alive with eerie rustling. Tears thought, her heart pounding in her chest, as still watching. "Hey!" low whisper, faint but unmistakable, broke the silence. "You can't run from me, Sarah." The voice wasn't coming from the figure in the distance. It was all around her, inside her mind, reverberating through her skull. The Watcher was speaking to her, his voice haunting, cold, like it was weaving into the very fabric of her thoughts. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. She had escaped once, hadn't she? She had escaped the dark apartment, the endless hallway. She had been free. Free for a moment. But now she was trapped again, this time in a forest that felt both surreal and suffocating. She spun around, trying to shake off the feeling, but the forest seemed endless. The trees blurred together, no path ahead of her, no clear direction. It felt like the space around her was infinite, looping in on itself, pulling her deeper and deeper and deeper into the unknown tap. A single tap echoed in at the end to the distance, cutting through the growing wind. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like footsteps moving toward her from the darkness. Each step, each tap, rang out with a finality that made Sarah's blood run cold. She turned back toward the figure standing at the edge of the trees. The Watcher had moved closer. Not fast. No, he moved with purpose, with an eerie calm, like he had all the time in the world. The same cold presence that had haunted her before now surrounded her once more. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. No matter how far she walked, no matter how hard she tried to escape, the Watcher would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. "You can't outrun me, Sarah," the voice echoed in her mind again. This time, it was sharper, more forceful. "I will always find you." She stumbled backward, her legs trembling beneath her, her body shaking with fear. Her mind screamed at her to run, but there was no way out, no escape. The trees, the shadows, the silence, it was all closing in and closing her in this unending nightmare. Her thoughts raced. There had to be something she could do. There had to be a way to end this, to stop the Watcher from getting to her. But all she could feel was the weight of his presence, suffocating her from every direction. And then Just as the first tendrils of despair began to creep in, something shifted. The ground beneath her feet trembled. A low rumble, distant at first, then growing louder, vibrating through the air. Sarah froze. What was happening? The rumbling intensified, like the very earth was shaking. The trees around her began to sway, their branches groaning under an unseen pressure. The darkness that had once loomed at the edges of her vision began to ripple, distorting like water in a storm. Then she saw it. A figure appeared in the distance, not the watcher. No, this figure was different. It was surrounded by a faint, glowing light, as if it were a beacon in the storm, and as it moved closer, Sarah felt the air grow lighter, the weight of the watcher's presence lifting, just for a moment. The new figure stepped into view, an old woman, frail but determined. Her clothes were ragged, torn from the elements, but she carried an air of wisdom, of power, that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The woman's eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for the first time she felt seen, truly seen. "You've been chosen. You've been chosen," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a strange resonance. It wasn't the watcher's voice, not that cold whispering. It was warm, protective. "But you are not alone, not anymore." The woman extended a hand towards Sarah, a calm, reassuring gesture. Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to do, but then she felt something shift inside her. It was a strange sensation, like an invisible weight lifting from her chest. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope without thinking. She reached out, taking the woman's hand, and in that moment, the world around her shattered. The trees, the forest, the watcher, all of it seemed to disintegrate, crumbling like dust caught in the wind. The light around them intensified, and Sarah felt herself being pulled forward through the very fabric of reality itself. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat as she was drawn into the light. When everything settled, Sarah found herself standing in an unfamiliar place, a quiet meadow bathed in soft golden light. The air smelled of flowers and earth and alreadies. The air smelled of flowers and earth, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the grass was the only sound she could hear. The woman stood beside her, a small smile on her lips. "You're safe now," the woman whispered. "But remember, Sarah, the watcher will always be there, watching, waiting. He cannot be destroyed." Sarah nodded, her mind reeling. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. For now, as Sarah stood in the meadow, the calmness around her felt almost unreal. Golden light bathed the land, making everything seem peaceful, serene. But as the woman beside her spoke, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The watcher was still out there. She could feel it in her bones, that constant weight in the air, that pull, that presence that never fully left her. He had always been there, watching, waiting, and now, even in this peaceful, almost magical place, she knew that the watcher would find her again. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said I'm safe now, but I don't feel safe." "Not really." The woman turned toward her, her eyes dark but filled with something more, wisdom perhaps, or knowing. "There is no permanent escape from him," the woman said, her voice heavy with a quiet sorrow. "But you have been given a choice, a chance, something most others never have." Sarah felt a deep shiver run down her spine, but she steadied herself. "What choice? What chance?" she asked, confusion and fear mingling in her voice. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The woman smiled faintly, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must choose," she said softly. "You can stay here, in this place, in this illusion of safety. But it is not truly freedom, and the watcher, he will never stop. you will never be free of him. Or you can return to the real world, to the fight, and face him on your terms. It is your choice. Sarah's mind raced. Stay here, in this idyllic meadow, forever trapped in a false sense of peace? Or return to the real world, to face the Watcher again, knowing the terror he brought? For a moment, she considered the first option. It was tempting, being free from fear, from the constant pressure of his presence. The thought of living in peace was almost too much to resist. But then she remembered the darkness, the cold breath of the Watcher against her neck, the way he had always been there, stalking her every move. She couldn't stay here, not forever. "He'll go back," Sarah said firmly, her voice steady. "I won't run anymore." The woman's eyes softened, and she gave a slow nod. "Very well," she said quietly, as though she had been expecting this answer. "You will be tested again, Sarah, but know this, he will always come for you, no matter how far you run. The Watcher never lets go." Before Sarah could respond, the light around them flickered. The meadow began to distort, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The peaceful scene was fading, collapsing in on itself like a dream that was slipping away. "Wait," Sarah shouted, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's happening? Where am I going?" The woman's form began to blur as the light around Sarah dimmed. "You are not truly safe yet," she said, her voice a distant echo. "But you will know when the time comes. You have the strength. You have the power to face him." The world around, Sarah spun faster, the meadow evaporating into nothingness until there was only darkness. Her body felt weightless again, and for a moment she thought she was falling, spiraling into the void. But then the world solidified around her, and she found herself standing in the middle of a familiar but terrifying place. Her apartment, the apartment she had been running from. Sarah blinked, disoriented. The once comforting, cozy space now felt suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. The light from the street outside flickered through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. She could feel it. The Watcher was near. She wasn't alone. She turned quickly, scanning the room. "There!" She turned quickly, scanning the room. "There!" Standing just inside the door was the figure, the Watcher. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. His presence filled the room like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. She could feel the air growing colder, the temperature dropping as his figure slowly advanced. Sarah's heart raced, but this time she didn't freeze. She couldn't. She wasn't going to let him take her again. "You shouldn't have come back, Sarah." His voice was cold, like ice scraping against metal. It cut through the silence of the room, sending a shiver down her spine. "I've been waiting." Sarah's mind screamed for her to run, but she stood her ground. She was tired of running. She was done being afraid. She had faced him before. She could do it again. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. "You don't control me." For the first time, the Watcher stopped moving. He stood moving. He stood there in the middle of the room, silent. Sarah didn't know what was happening. Was he surprised? Was he confused? "You think you've escaped me?" His voice was low, almost a growl now. "You can't escape what you are. You can't escape me, Sarah." But Sarah was no longer the same person. She had faced him, seen his true power, and she knew now what she had to do with all her strength. She took a step forward, her gaze locked on the Watcher. She wasn't backing down. Not this time. "I'm not yours to take anymore," she whispered, her voice full of defiance. The Watcher's expression, what little of it she could see, darkened. His eyes narrowed, the shadows around him growing deeper, colder, and then something unexpected happened. A bright, blinding light exploded in the room. The Watcher recoiled, stepping back, his form flickering as if it were unraveling. Sarah raised her hand, and the light grew stronger, engulfing him. The walls of her apartment began to crack, the reality around her splintering. She felt a surge of power, the same power that had been given to her by the mysterious woman. The Watcher screamed, a chilling, inhuman sound. But the light intensified. The darkness around him began to crumble, like dust in the wind. The Watcher was fading, but Sarah knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end, wasn't over. Watcher would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. But for now, in this moment, she had won. The light began to fade, and Sarah stood in the empty room, breathing heavily, her hands still crackling with energy. The Watcher was gone. For now. And Sarah finally understood. He would never stop, but neither would she. The room fell silent as the last remnants of the Watcher's presence faded away. Sarah stood alone in the center of her apartment, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The energy that had surged through her, that bright light that had repelled the Watcher, was slowly dissipating, leaving her feeling drained, like she had just run a marathon. But as the feeling walked in vainly, silence stretched on, she realized something. The Watcher was gone, for now, at least. But that didn't mean the terror was over. In fact, Sarah knew better than to think for even a moment that this was the final victory. The apartment once was the final victory. The apartment, once filled with an ominous weight, now felt unnaturally still. The air was thick, as if holding its breath. The streetlight outside flickered through the blinds, casting faint shadows across the walls, scanning every corner, every shadow. Was it really over? She moved toward the window, hesitant, yet drawn to it. As she approached, the familiar feeling of being watched returned, creeping up her spine. She hesitated, staring out into the night. The street was empty, silent, just as it had always been. Silent. Sabir's. The girl would tell you browse and go total work with Alfred P.I. The street was empty, silent, just as it had always been. But she could feel it, the Watcher's presence lingering, even if he was no longer physically there. The chill returned, and her breath fogged the glass. She wiped it away, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she thought she's rather serious. Saw something shift behind her, something in the shadows. But when she turned, there was nothing. The room was still, empty. She stepped back, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do. She felt like she had won, but at the same time, the victory felt hollow. Had she really won? Or had she just bought herself more time? She had faced the Watcher, but he would return. She knew it. He always returned. But this time, she had something he hadn't counted on. She had a glimpse of his true nature, of his power, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Her phone, buzzed suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Sarah jumped, startled, and quickly grabbed it from the counter. It was a message from Rachel. She had been trying to get in touch with her all night. Are you okay? Where are you? Okay, I'm worried about you. Call me when you get this. Sarah stared at the message, her hands shaking as she typed back. I'm okay for now. I'm okay for now. I don't know how much longer this will last, but I'm not alone anymore. She pressed send and sat down on the couch, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, but all she could see in her mind was the image of the Watcher's eyes, dark, endless, watching her from the shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. A sudden noise broke her from her thoughts. A tapping? It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Tap, 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 tap. Her heart sank. No! Slowly, her pulse quickening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Her eyes darted to the window, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. She turned toward the door. Her breath shallow. The tapping stopped. Dead silence. For a moment she thought maybe, just maybe, it was over, but she knew better. Then, the door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Sarah's heart raced in her chest. She didn't move, didn't breathe, as she stared at the slowly opening door. The air around her felt cold, too cold. She could feel the presence again, just like before. Dark, oppressive, and close. The door creaked open wider, inch by inch. And then, just as the door opened fully, Sarah saw it, a figure, a shadow standing in the doorway, obscured by the darkness. She gasped, her blood running cold. It wasn't the watcher's face that stared back at her, but something worse. It was a silhouette, almost humanoid, but twisted, deformed. It was like the watcher, but not. Something even darker, something older, something that didn't belong to this world. It tilted its head slowly, and Sarah could hear its breath, slow and ragged. It stepped forward, its movement unnatural, jerky, like something was wrong with the way its limbs moved. Her body froze in place. She couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. The figure stepped closer, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold biting at her skin. The darkness around it seemed to swirl, wrapping around the figure like a cloak. A voice, deep and rasping, filled her mind. "You thought you could escape me." Sarah felt her stomach lurch. This wasn't him. This wasn't the watcher. This was something else entirely. Something far more terrifying. "You can't escape, Sarah. You belong to the shadows now." Before Sarah could react, the figure lunged toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, falling hard to the floor. The world spun around her as she scrambled to get up. Her limbs heavy with fear. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, its fingers cold and stiff like ice. Sarah screamed, but the sound was lost in the darkness that seemed to flood her senses. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room went quiet, too quiet. Sarah lay on the floor, gasping for air, her entire body trembling with terror. She glanced around the room. Nothing. No figure. No watcher. The door was still wide open, but there was no sign of the nightmare that had just unfolded in front of her. But the silence wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating. It felt like the calm before the storm, like the watcher, or whatever that thing had been, was just waiting. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart still. Sarah scrambled to her feet, racing. She didn't know what was real anymore. She didn't know what was coming next. All she knew was one thing. She couldn't stay here. She needed to get out, but as she stepped toward the door, she stopped. In the corner of the room, lying on the floor, was a small object, a black feather. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the black feather lying innocently in the corner of the room. It was the same as the one she had seen earlier, the one that had appeared before everything started to unravel. The same feeling of dread crept over her, and she knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some random object. It was a symbol, a reminder that the watcher was still there, lurking just beyond her reach, waiting. The room felt colder now, the silence thicker than before. She could feel the weight of the feather's presence, as if it were a tether pulling her back into the nightmare. The watcher had left once, but the lingering feeling of his healing, of his malevolent presence still filled the air. Sarah's hands shook as she reached down to pick up the feather, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. The moment she touched it, a jolt of cold shot through her hand, like a shock of ice running, through her veins. She recoiled instinctively, her heart racing. The feather, now in her grasp, felt wrong, unnatural. It was as if it didn't belong to this world, as if it had been torn from some other, darker place. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shake off the panic rising in her chest. She couldn't think about it. She couldn't let herself be consumed by it, but she couldn't help it. The figure, the thing she had seen earlier, was still fresh in her mind. The way it still fresh in her mind, the way it moved, twisted, and spoke. It wasn't just a shadow of the Watcher. No, it was something far worse. And now, it was tied to the feather. The feather was the key. She could feel it in her bones. Sarah tossed the feather back onto the floor, taking a step away from it, as if the mere act of holding it had cursed her. She needed to leave, to escape, but where could she go? The Watcher would find her again, just as he always did. There was no running, there was no hiding, and then she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart skipped a beat as she froze, every muscle in her body locking with fear. The sound, every muscle in her body locking with fear. The sound was unmistakable. The same rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. But the tapping wasn't the only sound. There was a low, guttural growl, like something deep within the walls, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with a malicious intent. Her eyes snapped to the window, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something move behind the blinds. A dark figure. Her blood ran cold. No, it couldn't be. The Watcher had returned. But when she rushed to the window, there was nothing there. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the walls now, each tap louder and more frantic than before. The walls around her seemed to vibrate, groaning as though they were being pulled from the inside out. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was worse than before. This wasn't just the Watcher. This was something else. The tapping stopped. Dead silence. The room grew colder, the air now thick with something darker, something alive in the space around her. Her breath was shallow, her fingers trembling as she backed away from the wall. Then, as if summoned by her fear, the door to the apartment creaked open, slowly. And there it was, the shadow, the same twisted figure, standing in the doorway. Its face was hidden, but Sarah could feel its gaze on her, as though it were studying her, waiting for the moment to strike. It stepped forward, moving for the moment to strike. It stepped forward, moving toward her with an unnatural smoothness. She could feel the chill emanating from it, the air growing colder, denser, suffocating. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed. The room felt smaller, closing in on her as the figure drew closer, its hand stretched toward her, long, bony fingers reaching for her throat. The shadows in the room seemed to reach out, wrapping around her like chains. She couldn't escape. She couldn't breathe. The figure was so close now, its fingers inches from her skin. And then, as if the very air was ripping itself apart, a loud crash shattered the silence. The figure froze, its hand retracting. A flash of light filled the room, so bright that Sarah had to shield her eyes. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. The room was still, completely still. She gasped for air, her body trembling from head to toe. Her heart raced, but the oppressive feeling had lifted. It was gone. Figure, the Watcher, they were all gone. but she knew better than to think it was over. Slowly, cautiously, she turned toward the source of the light. Her eyes went wide. A doorway had appeared, a doorway that hadn't been there before. It was faint, ethereal, glowing with the same light that had filled the room earlier. And beyond it, she could feel it, a pull, a force drawing her in. It was the only thing left in this place that felt real. The Watcher was still out there, but this was her chance. But as Sarah took a step forward, the whisper came again. A voice, deeper and darker than before, reverberated through her mind. You will never be free, Sarah. The shadows are always waiting, always watching. Her heart sank, but she kept walking. This was her moment, her chance to break free. She had faced the darkness, and now she would step into the light. With one last glance at the empty room, Sarah stepped through the doorway, and everything went black. Sarah's heart pounded as she crossed the threshold, stepping into the doorway. The moment she did, the world around her seemed to shift, like a violent wave crashing over her, pulling her further into an unknown realm. It was like stepping through a veil, and for an instant, she couldn't see anything. She was suspended in darkness, the air thick and suffocating. Her feet landed softly on what felt like solid ground, but the world around her remained black. There were none around her remained black. Sounds, no light, just the overwhelming silence and a strange, bone-chilling cold. She took a step forward, and with each movement, the space seemed to grow, stretching farther out of her reach. The silence stretched too long, becoming now deafening. Sarah's breath quickened, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. She didn't know where she was anymore. The shadows from her apartment, the Watcher, had followed her. They were here. Whatever here was. Hello? Sarah's voice broke the silence, but even as it left her mouth, it felt swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no echo, no reply. Just the oppressive, suffocating quiet, and then, faintly at first, she heard it, whispering. Soft, low, voices, indistinct and frantic, like 100 hushed conversations, blending together, rising and falling in a constant stream. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she felt them. Each whisper felt like fingers trailing along her spine, like they were brushing against her skin. She shuddered, trying to block out the noise, but the more she focused, the louder it became. The voices grew clearer. You can't escape. You belong here. The shadows are eternal. The whispers are eternal. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and chilling. Sarah's pulse raced. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one. Only the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. She clenched her fists. Refusing to give in. She couldn't be trapped again. Not here, not now. Her chest suffocating her until a bright, piercing light exploded in front of her. Sarah's breath hitched, and she squinted against the sudden brilliance. The light wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold and intense, like a spotlight aimed directly at her. But something about it felt familiar. She reached out, her hand shaking toward the light. As her fingers touched the source of the glow, it shifted. The light split open, revealing a door that was neither in front nor behind her but appeared in the center of this vast, empty space. Without thinking, she stepped forward and reached for the door handle, her hand trembling in anticipation. She felt a rush of fear, but also a surge of determination. This was a surge of determination. This was her chance. But as soon as her hand grasped the handle, she felt it. Something was pulling her back. The shadows seemed to stretch out and cling to her, wrapping around her legs, her arms, her chest. They were alive with alive. alive with a hunger she could feel deep within her bones. No, Sarah screamed, tugging at the door, trying to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows were pulling her, dragging her away from the light, back into the endless, suffocating dark. Then, from behind her, a voice called out. It was called out. It was soft, gentle, and somehow familiar. Sarah. The voice whispered her name, and she froze, feeling her heart leap into her throat. She knew that voice. She spun around, her eyes wide, desperate. And there, standing in the shadows, was a figure she hadn't seen in years. Her mother. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen her mother in so long, not since that night. Her mother was standing there, her eyes glowing with a strange, otherworldly light, her face serene but distant. "Mom," Sarah whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. But her mother didn't move. She didn't speak. The shadows seemed to shift around her mother's figure, dark tendrils wrapping around her like they were trying to pull her into the darkness. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "Mom? No!" Sarah screamed, stepping forward, reaching out, but the shadows grew stronger, pulling her mother further into the void. "You can't save her," the Watcher's voice rumbled, his presence looming over her, filling the air with the cold, suffocating chill of despair. "No one can save you now, Sarah." The shadows around Sarah grew tighter, colder, more suffocating. Her mother's figure began to fade, the light around her dimming, as if she were being swallowed by the darkness. "No!" Sarah cried out, desperate, her body shaking as the darkness closed in. But then something snapped, a flash of white light. The shadows recoiled, pulling away from her, shrinking back, powerful. Sarah gasped for breath, looking up at the door, which had opened wider than before. Her mother was gone. The darkness was gone. This was her last chance. With every ounce of strength left in her body, Sarah pushed forward, shoving her body. Sarah pushed forward, shoving the door open and stepping through. Out of the darkness, the light consumed her completely. Sarah stepped through the light and felt it engulf her completely, wrapping around her like a cocoon. She didn't know how much time had passed, whether she was still in the same world, or if she had crossed into something beyond her understanding. All she could feel was the cold and the darkness clinging to her skin, refusing to let go. But the light held firm. It wasn't warm. It wasn't warm, yet it gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of safety. For the first time since the Watcher had appeared, she felt as if she had reclaimed some control. She wasn't running anymore. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden clarity. The world around her shifted again, becoming sharper, more defined. The light around her faded, not disappearing, but transforming into something else. The shadows that had once haunted her now seemed distant, like memories slipping away. She, shipping away, looked around. She was in a new place, one that felt eerily familiar and yet so foreign. The place was bright, too bright, and yet strangely comforting. It was like a perfect version of her old apartment, but everything seemed wrong. The furniture was all there, but nothing was in the right place. The walls seemed to breathe, to pulse, as though the space itself were alive. Her feet felt heavier as she stepped further into the room, the floor creaking beneath her. The thing felt creaking beneath her. Sensation of being watched lingered, growing stronger with every step. She was no longer alone. And then the door slammed shut behind her. Sarah spun around, panic rising in her chest. The door was locked. There was no exit. She was trapped again. Tap, 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 tap. The sound came from behind her, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the far, hammering in her chest corner of the room, was the Watcher. His figure was still indistinct, but she could feel his presence. The air grew colder. No, Sarah whispered to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. No, not again. But the Watcher didn't move, just stood there, still as stone, staring at her from the corner of the room, his face hidden in the shadows. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the walls this time. The floor, everywhere. It was as if the very structure of the room had become a living entity, pulsating with the rhythm of the Watcher's relentless gaze. You can't run, the Watcher's voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't his usual whisper. This time, it was louder, more forceful. You will always be mine. You will always be mine. You will never escape. Sarah's body shook. She was losing control. She had faced him before, but this was different. The air was thick with his power. The walls closed in around her, and the whispers returned, louder, more frantic. What do you want from me? Sarah cried, her voice breaking as the panic surged within her. The Watcher didn't answer. He simply stepped forward, moving closer, his face still hidden by the shadows. The temperature in the room dropped, and Sarah could see her breath forming in front of her, the chill sinking deeper into her bones. You will never be free, the Watcher said again, his voice an unearthly growl, vibrating through her skull. I am everywhere. I am the shadow that lingers. You cannot escape me. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred with the fear, the pressure of the room, the weight of his voice. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. She was paralyzed by the sheer intensity of his presence. And then, out of the corner of her eye, something else moved. A figure, standing in the doorway. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the Watcher. This figure was different. A woman. She wore old, tattered clothes, her face shadowed by a dark hood, but something about her felt familiar. The figure stepped into the room, the shadows seeming to pull away from her as she moved, as if she carried light with her. The Watcher seemed to recoil slightly, his form flickering as though the woman's presence was a threat. Sarah's voice caught in her throat as the woman approached, her footsteps silent but firm. There was something in the woman's eyes, something that felt like hope. Sarah, the woman said softly, her voice filled with both sadness and strength. You are not alone. You are not bound by the Watcher. You have the power to break free, the Watcher hissed, his form shifting violently as if reacting to the woman's words. He seemed to shrink, as though her mere presence was draining him of his power. The air seemed to crackle with energy as Sarah felt the room begin to shift once more, the boundaries between worlds starting to blur. Who are you? Woo, Sarah asked, her voice weak, but filled with a flicker of hope. She took a hesitant step forward, unsure of whether to trust this mysterious woman. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering with a deep understanding. I am someone who has deep understanding. I am someone who has been where you are, Sarah. I was once like you, lost and hunted by the Watcher. But I found a way to stop running. And now, so can you. The Watcher screamed in rage, his figure convulsing, but the woman's presence seemed to shield Sarah, a barrier of light surrounding her. Sarah could feel the energy radiating from the woman, filling her with a sense of purpose, a strength she hadn't known she had. You have the power to end this, the woman continued. But you must choose. You, woman continued. But you must choose. Must face the Watcher one last time and take back what he has stolen from you. He can only rule you if you let him. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the woman's words pressing on her. Could she really do it? Could she stand up to the Watcher and finally end this nightmare? The Watcher's voice rumbled in the background, deep and menacing. You will never defeat me. You will never be free. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, her hand clenching into a fist. She had run long enough. She had been afraid long enough. She was done. The Watcher's laughter filled the room, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. Not when she knew the truth. Not when she knew the power she had within her. She turned to face the Watcher. This time, she was ready. And with that, the battle for her freedom began. The room seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in as Sarah stood face to face with the Watcher. His form loomed tall in the shadows, the very embodiment of terror. But now, it felt different. Something had shifted in Sarah. The fear that had once consumed her, that had paralyzed her every time he appeared, was no longer there. She could feel the power rising within her, the strength the woman had spoken of. It was there, deep inside her, pulsing like a heartbeat, ready to be unleashed. You think you can defeat me? The Watcher hissed, his voice cold and taunting, vibrating through the air. You're nothing. You're weak. You belong to the shadows. Sarah's eyes narrowed. His words didn't have the same weight anymore. She had faced him before, but now she wasn't the frightened woman who had fled in fear. She was stronger, more determined, and she wasn't alone. I don't belong to you, Sarah said, her voice steady, a newfound confidence flowing through her. I've learned that the only thing that controls me is me. The Watcher's form flickered, his darkness seeming to writhe and shift, but Sarah didn't back down. She took a step forward, then another, and another, and another, each movement more certain, more powerful than the last. The light from the woman still surrounded her, a protective force that seemed to grow brighter with each step she took toward the Watcher. He growled, his face twisting in anger, his eyes glowing like burning embers in the shadows. You will eyes glowing like burning embers in the shadows. You will regret this. The shadows around him began to shift, coiling like serpents, moving toward her with lightning speed. But Sarah didn't flinch. With a swift motion, she held out her hand and the light around her flared. Brighter than ever before, the shadows recoiled, the light pushing them back like water parting before a tide. You can't control me, she repeated, her voice rising, becoming a battle cry. I am the light, the Watcher snarled, his form flickering violently, as if the light was beginning to tear him apart. He lunged toward her, but this time, she was ready. As his darkness surged forward, Sarah thrust her hand out, and the light expanded, enveloping the room, filling every corner, crevice. It grew, a brilliant force of pure energy, banishing the shadows and pushing the Watcher back. No, this isn't over. You can't defeat me, the Watcher's voice rang out, a distorted screech of fury. But Sarah could feel him weakening, his power slipping away with each second. The light surged once more, brighter, stronger, until the very walls around them seemed to pulse with it. And then, with one final, explosive surge of light, the Watcher's form shattered. The darkness shattered with him, collapsing into nothingness. For a long moment, Sarah stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, her body trembling from the intensity of the battle. The light around her dimmed, but it didn't vanish. It lingered, protecting her, surrounding her in a warm, reassuring glow. The room was quiet now, the oppressive feeling gone. She was alone again. But this feeling gone. Time, it was different. This time she was free. A soft, reassuring presence appeared beside her. The woman. You did it, the woman said, her voice calm. Proud. You faced him and overcame his power. You have broken the cycle, Sarah. Nodded, though she felt exhausted. She had done it. She had faced her fear, defeated the Watcher, and taken back her power. But she knew the truth. He would never truly be gone. He was always watching, always waiting. But now she knew that. Now, she knew that she was stronger. She knew that she could face him again, if she had to. And the next time she would be ready. "What now?" Sarah asked, looking up at the woman, her voice uncertain but filled with resolve. The woman smiled gently. "Now, you live. You've broken free. The path ahead is yours to choose." Sarah looked around, the light still glowing softly around. The light still glowing softly around her. She felt the weight of the Watcher's influence finally lifting, for the first time in what felt like forever. She felt truly free, but as the woman's form began to fade, a small, chilling thought crossed her mind. The Watcher had been cast beyond their call they looked her. If the syringe tree to the charred deal say bearer and a knocker necked on Watcher had been defeated. But Sarah could feel something else, something lurking, something deeper than the shadows. The dark presence that had haunted her was gone for now. But it was only a matter of time before something else rose in its place. Something even more terrifying. Sarah turned away from the fading light, knowing her journey was far from over. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Sarah's breath was still shallow, her heart racing from the intensity of what had just transpired. The woman had faded, leaving Sarah alone in the room once more, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the eerie quiet that had clung to her in the past. It was peaceful, but with an edge of uncertainty, like the calm before the storm. The Watcher was gone, for now, but something still felt wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, an unsettling tension that lingered in the air. She glanced around the apartment. The room that had once felt like a prison now felt more like a sanctuary, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched again, no longer by the Watcher, but by something else, something new. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble slightly, a soft vibration that she could almost feel in her bones. The walls around her began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound. She took a step forward, then another, feeling drawn toward the door, toward the unknown pain. A feeling of dread swept over her. The Watcher was gone. The Watcher was gone, yes, but she had learned that evil was never really gone. It always came back, in some form or another, always waiting for the right moment to return. Sarah reached for the right moment to return. Sarah reached for the door, her hand trembling as she grasped the handle. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, and pushed the door open. As the door creaked open, a blast of cold air hit her, causing her to shiver involuntarily. The world outside the door was not the familiar street she had come to know. Instead, it was a desolate, barren landscape, stretching out in every direction. The sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to writhe and twist unnaturally, like the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. In the distance, she saw a figure. It was just a silhouette, standing motionless, staring at her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she knew immediately that it was not the Watcher, but something else. Something else. Something even darker. Something older. The figure began to move toward her, slowly, deliberately, its steps almost imperceptible in the wind. As it came closer, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in her chest. The air around her seemed breath. This wasn't over. Before Sarah could react, the figure spoke. "You think you've escaped me?" The voice rumbled, low and resonant. It wasn't the Watcher's voice. It was different, ancient and terrifying. "But I'm always watching, always waiting. You cannot outrun me." The ground beneath her feet cracked, the earth splitting apart as though it were being torn asunder. Sarah stumbled back in the shadows. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The world around her was collapsing, warping, as the figure came closer and closer, its presence filling the air. This wasn't just a shadow. The figure stepped into the light. Its face emerged from the darkness, revealing a twisted, monstrous visage like nothing Sarah had ever seen before. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, pupils dilated to unnatural proportions, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. It grinned at her, a smile that sent chills down her spine. "You will never be free," the creature hissed, its voice almost a growl. "I am the darkness that has been waiting for you. And now I have you?" Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, the weight of the creature's presence crushing her. But she couldn't give up. She had fought the Watcher. She had fought for her freedom, and she wouldn't give it up now. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah stood tall, staring into the creature's eyes. Her hand trembled, but she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the black feather, the same feather that had appeared earlier. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, a surge of energy coursed through her. The darkness around her seemed to recoil, the creature's twisted grin faltering for a moment. Sarah stepped forward, holding the feather in front of her like a shield, the energy radiating from it glowing, brighter than ever before. "I am not yours to take," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, filled with power. "I won't be your prisoner," the creature snarled, its eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It lunged forward, its eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and disbelief, claws swiping toward her. But Sarah was ready. She thrust the feather forward, and the light it emitted exploded outward, pushing the creature back. The darkness around them shrieked, the sound deafening, as the creature's form began to disintegrate, torn apart by the light. The wind howled, swirling around them like a violent storm, and the world began to shudder. But Sarah didn't back down. She stood firm, the light growing brighter, engulfing everything in its path. The creature screamed one final deafening cry as its form dissolved into nothingness, the darkness it had brought with it dissipating like smoke in the wind. Silence for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Sarah stood in the quiet. The air around her was still, the ground solid beneath her feet. She looked around, and the world was no longer the twisted, barren landscape it had been. It was calm, peaceful even, as though she had crossed through some barrier, some threshold, into a new reality. The feather in her hand pulsed gently, a soft light now radiating from it. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that it had been the key. It had been the power that had given her the strength to face the darkness, and had given her the chance to finally break free. But even as she stood there, surrounded by peace, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Something watching. Something watching. Something watching. Something waiting. And in the distance there was another figure, another shadow, standing at the edge of the horizon, looking toward her. She wasn't finished yet. As Sarah stood in the peaceful landscape, the feather still glowing in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The calmness of the environment surrounded her, yet the distant figure on the horizon was an unsettling reminder that the darkness had not been fully vanquished. The peacefulness of the moment was a lie. The shadows were never truly gone, only waiting for the right moment to return. She felt the tension rise in the air, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. The figure in the distance stood motionless, its form unclear, but Sarah could feel its gaze burning into her. She knew it wasn't over. The feather pulsed with light, its energy still strong, but she could feel it waning. The Watcher was gone. For now, but who, or what, was that figure on the horizon? A whisper of wind stirred, and Sarah instinctively tightened her grip on the feather, her heart quickening in her chest. The unknown figure, now slightly closer, remained silent, but Sarah could sense that it wasn't like the Watcher, something else. Something new, and it was coming closer. With determination, Sarah took a step forward, toward the figure, her eyes locked onto it. Whatever this new threat was, she wouldn't back down. She had faced the darkness before, and she could do it again. But as she moved toward the figure, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the world itself was shifting. A cold wave of dread washed over her, pulling at her. She could do it, feel it in her bones. The thing she was about to face was not just a shadow. It was a force, a power that had been waiting for this moment. As the figure moved closer, Sarah braced herself. The time for running was over. It was time to face whatever was out there. The darkness may have many faces, but Sarah knew now that she had the strength to face them all. And as she stood there, ready to face whatever came next, the figure finally spoke. You think you've won, but the war has only just begun. The battle was far from over. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the figure's words echoed in the air, hanging between them like a heavy fog. The calmness around her seemed to flicker, like the peace had been a fragile illusion, masking something much darker beneath. The figure's voice wasn't the same as the Watcher's. It wasn't cold or mocking. It was deep, powerful, and somehow ancient. Something about it resonated with a terrifying truth. This wasn't just some new shadow to face. It was a force beyond comprehension. The figure took another step forward, its form becoming clearer in the dimming light. Sarah could see now that it wasn't humanoid in shape, but something far more unsettling. It was as if the darkness itself had taken a physical form, a twisting mass of shadows and light, constantly shifting and undulating. It had no true shape, no clear face, just an overwhelming presence. Who are you? Sarah demanded, trying to steady her voice despite the growing fear that gnawed at her insides. The figure tilted its head, an almost mocking gesture. I am what you have failed to defeat. Sarah, I am the fear that has been buried in your heart, the shadows that you have run from. Her stomach twisted. She had faced the Watcher. She had confronted darkness before, but this was different. The Watcher had been a force, yes, but this being seemed to embody something deeper, something primal. I don't fear you, Sarah said, more to herself than to the figure. She clutched the feather tightly, feeling its energy still pulsing within her, but now it felt strained, as though it was reaching its limits. The figure let out a low, rumbling laugh. Fear is not something you choose, child. It is something that exists within you, and it is something that will always find you, no matter how far you run. Sarah stood taller, trying to push back the waves of dread that the figure's presence was pulling out of her. It was true, she realized. She had been running her entire life, from her past, from the Watcher, from the things that haunted her mind. But now, she was done running. She had faced the darkness before, and she would do it again. You're wrong, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. I faced my fears. I've learned what you are, what you represent. You are nothing but shadows, and shadows can be beaten. The figure's laugh stopped abruptly. It shifted, its form flickering like a dying flame. Shadows can be beaten, yes, but what happens when the light fades? It asked, its voice a twisted whisper. A sudden chill ran through Sarah's body. and she knew the figure was speaking the truth. The light around her, the power of the feather. It had been strong, but it wasn't permanent. It couldn't last forever. The balance between light and darkness had always been delicate. Sarah glanced down at the feather in her hand. She had used its power to defeat the Watcher, to escape the darkness, but now she felt its energy waning, its light, its energy waning, its light flickering as though it too was growing tired. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on her like a physical force. "But I will fight," Sarah said firmly, staring at the figure. She could feel the tremor in her voice, but she would feel the tremor in her voice, but she would not let it show. "I've fought before, and I will fight again, no matter what you are." The figure took another step forward, its presence overwhelming. "Fighting is futile, Sarah. You cannot fight what you are. The shadows have always been inside you, waiting to come out. They are your past, your regrets, your fears. They are you." The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to shake, as though the world itself was reacting to the figure's words. The trees around them began to warp and twist, the sky above darkening, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to bend. "No," Sarah whispered, a cold realization beginning to form in her mind. She was facing more than just a shadow. This wasn't just about the Watcher or any single darkness. This figure was the embodiment of everything she had feared in her life. It was everything she had tried to outrun, but she refused to accept it. "You will never control me," Sarah said with a quiet but powerful determination, her grip on the feather tightening. The figure tilted its head, as if curious. "You think your defiance will save you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the deep recesses of her mind, finding the strength that had been buried there for so long. She had run from her past, from the things she feared, but now she had learned to face them. The shadows, the darkness. They couldn't hold her anymore. With a surge of energy, Sarah raised the feather high above her head. Light exploded from it, brighter than ever before, pushing the shadows back, piercing the darkness. The figure screamed in fury as the light surrounded it, burning through the very fabric of its being. "No, you cannot defeat me," the figure howled, its form flickering violently, as if it were unraveling at the seams. Sarah held firm, the light intensifying, flooding the space around them. The darkness around the figure began to collapse, breaking apart like a shattered gold-spraying mirror, each piece dissolving into nothingness. And then, with a final scream of rage, the figure vanished. The shadows that had once clung to the air dissipated, leaving only a quiet, empty space behind. For a moment, Sarah stood there, unaware. There's space behind, breathing heavily, the light around her slowly dimming. She could feel the weight of the struggle fade, the tension in the air easing. But she knew it wasn't over. The darkness was always there, waiting for its chance to return. And when it did, Sarah would be ready. The air around Sarah grew still, the calmness settling over her like a blanket. She stood alone in the quiet, the remnants of the battle still lingering in the air. But there was something different now. The sensing different now. The sense of overwhelming dread had faded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. But the feeling that something wasn't over, something was still watching her, remained. The space around her felt lighter, yes, but there was an undercurrent, an unsettling energy that had yet to be dispelled. She had defeated the creature, or whatever it was, but she knew that in the world she lived in, nothing stayed defeated for long. She looked down at the chipped feather in her hand. It was still glowing, but its light had dimmed, flickering like a candle about to burn out. She wasn't sure how much time she had before the darkness would return, before the Watcher, or whatever this new threat was, strike again. As Sarah moved to set the feather down, The ground beneath her feet shook. The tremor was small at first, but it grew in intensity. The air around her began to hum with energy, and the light around her flickered again. Something was happening. A voice, soft but unmistakable, echoed through the air. Sarah, she froze. That voice, she knew it. It was her mother's. Mom, Sarah whispered, spinning around, her heart racing. Was she imagining it? Hadn't her mother disappeared? Was this another trick of the darkness, a final attempt to break her? You've done well, Sarah, the voice continued, this time clearer, more real. But there is still much to be done. The wind swirled around her, and for a moment, Sarah saw the faint outline of her mother standing at the edge of the dimming light. The figure seemed blurred, almost transparent, but there was no mistaking it. It was her mother. But there was something different about her. Something far more otherworldly. What do you mean? Sarah called out, taking a step forward. What do I need to do? Her mother's figure stepped forward, though still far from her reach, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sadness. There was something distant, something unreachable about her presence. The Watcher is just one part of a much larger force. Her Watcher is just one part of a much larger force. Her mother said softly. You have faced him. Yes, but the true battle lies ahead. What you have done here, what you have learned, is just the beginning of the journey. The words hung in the air like a warning. One Sarah didn't fully understand. She had thought this was the end. She had thought she had finally overcome the darkness. But her mother's words made her realize that she was only on the cusp of something far more dangerous. What do I do now? Sarah asked, the desperation creeping into her voice. How do I stop it? How do I stop what's coming? Her mother's gaze softened, though it was tinged with sorrow. You cannot stop it, Sarah. The darkness is eternal, and it will always find a way back, but you have the strength to face it. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process the gravity of what her mother was saying. But I beat it. I defeated it. The Watcher is gone. Her mother shook her head slowly, her form flickering again. No, child, he is never truly gone. His influence, his grip on this world is eternal. But now you are different. You are no longer bound by the fear. You know the truth now. You have seen the darkness for what it is. That is the power you carry. Sarah's heart ached. She'd be expected to carry on fighting if the darkness was never truly gone. Was she destined to keep battling forever? And what was this new force her mother spoke of? What was lurking in the shadows now? Her mother's figure began to fade. The words she spoke lingered in the air like a haunting refrain. You must find the source, Sarah. Find what feeds the darkness. That is the only way to truly defeat it. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure of her mother disappeared, fading into the swirling winds. The last whisper of her voice echoed through Sarah's mind, lingering like a ghost. The source. The room around her darkened again, and the familiar sense of dread returned, settling like a weight on her chest. Sarah's pulse quickened as she looked around. The peaceful landscape had disappeared, replaced by an endless sea of fog and shadows. The Watcher might be gone, but the battle was far from over. She looked at the feather in her hand once more, its glow now dim and flickering. It had been the key to her survival, her victory over the Watcher. But now it seemed like just a symbol of her uncertainty. She had learned what she needed it to do, but there were still more questions, more shadows waiting to be uncovered. Sarah steeled herself. There was no turning back. The true darkness hadn't yet revealed itself. But she knew one thing for sure. She would find it. She would find it. She would face it. And this time, she would end it for good. Sarah stood in the midst of the growing shadows, the air thick with the weight of her mother's words. The quiet that had surrounded her before was now broken, replaced by an overwhelming sense of uncertainty and the undeniable feeling that the fight was far from over. The source, the words repeated in her mind, echoing through her like a drumbeat. It was the only clue she had, the only lead that could possibly guide her through the dark maze she now found herself in. But the deeper question gnawed at her. What is the source? She looked at the feather still clutched in her hand. Its light was faint now, almost like a dying ember, but she could still feel its energy pulsing through her. It had saved her before, but Sarah knew that it wasn't enough anymore. Darkness wasn't just physical. It was deeper than that. It fed on something, and she needed to find out what it was before it consumed her completely. As the fog around her thickened, she noticed something new in the distance, a flickering light, almost imperceptible at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. A strange feeling rose in her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She felt compelled to move toward it, as if it was the answer she had been searching for. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to pull her down into its depths. The air grew colder, and the fog pressed in on her, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The light beckoned her forward, drawing her toward it like a magnet. When she finally reached it, she found herself standing before a massive stone structure, half sunken into the ground. It was old, ancient even, covered in moss and creeping vines, yet it radiated an eerie power. The flickering light came from the center, where a dark, swirling energy pulsed and throbbed. The source. This was it. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself as she stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the stone, the ground beneath her trembled. The pulsing light grew stronger, brighter, and the air became charged with an oppressive energy. The darkness that had followed her for so long seemed to swirl around the structure, crawling toward her, and then, from within the swirling energy, a figure emerged. It wasn't the Watcher, but something far worse, a being formed of shadow, its body twisting and shifting, constantly changing shape. Face was a blur, like an unfinished painting, but the eyes glowed with an unnatural light, staring at her with a hunger that sent chills through her body. "You have come to face the source," the being said, its voice echoing through Sarah's mind. It was a low, guttural sound, like the whisper of the wind through a graveyard. "But you do not know what you are facing." Sarah stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. The light from the feather flickered again, casting long shadows across the stone structure. She raised it high, willing the light to grow stronger. "I know what you are," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the fear creeping at the edges of her words. "You are fear, darkness, the fear that feeds on every soul, but I will not let you win. I won't let you control me." The being's form twisted in response, its shadowy body bending and contorting, as if the very air around it was alive with malevolent energy. "You think you have the power to defeat me?" it hissed. "You are nothing but a fragment, a flicker in the dark. You have no idea what you're truly up against." Sarah's grip tightened on the feather. The light around her grew brighter, its pulse matching her heartbeat. She could feel the energy building, pushing against the darkness. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. She had to tap into something deeper. She had to confront the source of the fear that had controlled her for so long. "I am not afraid of you," Sarah whispered, her voice stronger now. "I will face you, and I will destroy you. You have no hold over me anymore." The shadow being's eyes flickered, and for a moment it seemed to pause, as though considering her words. Then it let out a sound that was not quite laughter, but a twisted mockery of it. "You think you can destroy me?" it asked, its voice growing darker, more malevolent. "I am not something that can be destroyed, Sarah. I am the shadows that exist within every soul. I am the fear that has always been there, waiting for you to break. I will never leave." The ground beneath her feet rumbled again, and Sarah could feel the structure beginning to crack, the very fabric of reality itself tearing as the being's power began to grow. The darkness wrapped around her, squeezing her, suffocating her, squeezing her. But then, in that moment, something shifted within her. She could feel it. The light, deep inside her, stronger than it had ever been before. The fear that had once consumed something she could control. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the one in control. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Summoning the strength within her, she had faced her darkest fears, her deepest regrets, and she had come out on the other side. Now, she would not let this being, this darkness, take her. With a final surge of energy, Sarah thrust the feather forward, sending a brilliant wave of light toward the source. The light exploded, bright and blinding. The being, it screamed, its form twisting and distorting. But it was too late. The light pierced through the darkness, unraveling it, piece by piece. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the darkness dissolved. The stone structure began to crumble, the energy that had once been the source of the fear fading into nothingness. Sarah stood, breathing heavily, her heart still racing. The darkness was gone, for now. But she knew the truth. The shadows would always return. The shadows would always return, would always be waiting, and the battle would never truly be over. But she would be ready. The aftermath of the battle left Sarah standing in the ruins of the stone structure, surrounded by the remnants of the fading darkness. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, as if the world itself had been torn apart and put back together. The sky above was still a swirling mix of dark clouds and fleeting light, but there was an unsettling calm. The air no longer vibrated with malevolent energy, but the peace felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Sarah's heart was still racing, her body trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. The feather, now dull and lifeless in her hand, had done its part, but its glow had long since faded. It had been her source of power, the light she had used to confront the darkness, but now it felt empty. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the decaying landscape. The shadows that had once surrounded her were gone, but the landscape itself seemed to be in a state of flux. The world felt like a place between worlds, shifting, uncertain, and unstable. The rupture caused by the battle had healed. It had merely been postponed. A distant, low rumble of thunder shook the ground beneath her feet, and she turned toward the sound. Something was coming. The wind picked up again, swirling around her, carrying with it a faint, familiar whisper. Sarah. Her breath caught in her whisper throat. It was the same whisper she had heard before, the one that had haunted her thoughts, the one that had plagued her every step, the Watcher's voice. But it didn't sound like it was coming from the air. It felt like it was coming from within her, from the very depths of her mind. She clutched the feather tighter, but it provided no comfort this time. The world around her seemed to warp again, the edges blurring, as if she were losing her grip on reality. Saw him, the Watcher, not in his usual form, but something far worse. His presence filled the horizon, a vast shadow, consuming everything in its path. His figure was more than just a man now. It was a force, an embodiment of everything Sarah had feared, everything that had pursued her since the moment she had first seen him at the window. His eyes burned like coals, and his mouth stretched into a twisted smile. "You thought you could stop me? You thought you could break free?" He boomed, his voice reverberating in the air like thunder. "But you cannot escape what you are, Sarah. You will always belong to the darkness. I am your fate." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. The Watcher hadn't been defeated. He had only been transformed, his power amplified by the confrontation. And now, it wasn't just her fight. It was the fight for the very fabric of reality itself. Her hand tightened around the feather again, and for a moment, she wondered if she had any strength left to face him. The Watcher had claimed victory before, but she had never given up. Not once. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The feather had given her power once before, but now, Sarah knew she had something even stronger within her. It wasn't the feather. It wasn't any outside force. It was the fire inside her, the will to stand against the darkness, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. The thick ground beneath her feet began to shake violently, and the Watcher's form advanced, the darkness stretching toward her like a vast ocean. But Sarah stood firm. Her eyes never left him, her breath steady. "You are not my fate," she said. You're not my fate," she said, her voice strong, defiant. "I choose my own path, and I will fight until the end." The Watcher's laughter rang through the air, hollow and mocking. "You cannot win. You cannot defeat what is eternal." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. What? Runs listening anymore. Could feel the energy building inside her, surging from the core of her being. She reached deep within herself and found it, the power that had been hidden in the shadows of her own soul. She raised her hand toward the Watcher, her hand toward the Watcher, her fingers crackling with light. This wasn't just about fighting him. It was about facing her own fear, about standing tall in the face of the darkness that had followed her for so long. It was about breaking the chains that had bound her to him. "I am not afraid of you anymore," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. The Watcher's figure hesitated, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The air around them pulsed with a new energy, and the darkness that had once been his strength began to retreat. For the first time, Sarah felt the balance shift in her favor. With a burst of light, Sarah shot a beam of pure energy from her outstretched hand, and it collided with the Watcher's chest. The explosion of light illuminated the entire landscape, the sheer power of it blinding, shaking the very core of the world. The Watcher let out a scream, the sound unbearable, a cacophony of rage and disbelief. His form began to break apart, disintegrating like ashes in the wind. Sarah pushed forward, every ounce of strength within her focused on the beam of light that tore through the Watcher's darkness. The shadow screamed one final time, and then it was gone. The wind died down, the rumbling ceased. The world, once on the brink of destruction, began to stabilize. Sarah stood alone once again, the aftermath of the battles surrounding her. Her body ached, but she felt a sense of relief that she hadn't known in years. She had done it. She had faced him. And for the first time, she had truly defeated him. But she knew the darkness would always be there, lurking. The Watcher's presence had been eradicated, but the shadows were eternal, waiting for the next soul to fall into their grasp. And she had no illusions that her fight was over. Still, for the first time, she felt free. She had taken back her power, and no darkness, no matter how strong, could take that away. She wasn't running anymore. The wind shifted once again, though this time it carried no threat. It was a gentle breeze, cool against Sarah's skin, and for a brief moment, She allowed herself to close her eyes and simply be. She had fought so long, through so many battles, always pushed forward by fear, by the darkness that had followed her. But now, she felt different, stronger, more in control. The weight of the past had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah allowed herself to exhale. But even as she stood there, in the calm after the storm, something nagged at her, a whisper, a presence just beyond the edges of her awareness. Her eyes snapped open. The sky was clearing, the swirling clouds parting to reveal the first light of dawn. The land around her, once torn apart by the conflict, was slowly beginning to heal. The ground beneath her was firm and stable, and for all its destruction, the world felt new, yet that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, remained. The watcher was gone, but Sarah had learned something crucial. Darkness never truly left. It morphed, shifted, waiting for the right moment to return. She was no fool. Sarah's gaze turned toward the horizon. The sun was rising, casting golden light across the landscape. But in the distance, something else was emerging. A shadow, a figure, vague and indistinct, standing at the edge of the world. Her stomach tightened. It was there, at the edge of the light, where the dark still lingered. Not a threat, not yet, but it was waiting, and she could feel it. You thought the watcher was the end. The voice, that same deep, resonant voice, echoed in her mind again. But this time, it wasn't the watcher's voice. It was something deeper, more ancient. The watcher was only the beginning. You will always be the beacon that calls the darkness back. And it will always answer. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Sarah gritted her teeth. She had fought so hard, only to realize that the battle was far from finished. The Watcher's presence had been just the tip of the iceberg. Whatever this new force was, whatever this new darkness had emerged, Sarah knew it wasn't going to be easy. She had thought she could find peace, but the more she faced these battles, the more she realized that the real war wasn't one of external enemies. It was the eternal fight between light and darkness. Fierce and courage within herself, the feather in her hand pulsed once more, its dim glow flickering. It wasn't just an object of power. It was a part of her now. The battles she fought weren't just with external forces. They were part of her soul. They were part of her soul. The light and dark that lived within her, the same way it lived in everyone. She could feel the pull of the darkness now, stronger than ever. It wasn't just some external force. It was an energy, a temptation, a part of her that had always been, there, whispering to her, waiting for her to fall back into its embrace. But she wouldn't. "I won't let you win," Sarah whispered under her breath, clenching the feather tightly. "Not again." She stepped forward, toward the figure on the horizon, her resolve firm. The journey was far from over. The darkness had many forms, and as long as Sarah lived, it would always find a way to return. But so would she. She would fight, as long as it took. The figure at the horizon remained still, almost waiting for her to approach, to make the first move. But Sarah had learned that sometimes you had to take the first step to confront the shadows head on. The light from the rising sun grew brighter, but she could still feel the presence of the shadow in the distance. It was drawing closer. This time, Sarah wouldn't wait for the fight to come to her. This time, she would be ready, and she would take the darkness on her terms, with the feather pulsing in her terms. Sarah made her way forward, knowing that this battle, just like all the others, would never be easy. But she had faced darkness before, and she would do it again. And with every battle, she would grow stronger. The war had only just begun. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Sarah moved toward the figure in the distance, the ground beneath her firm, but still trembling with the echo of the battle she had fought. The air felt different now, charged, heavy with anticipation. Her pulse quickened, and the feather in her hand flickered with a soft light, almost as if it recognized the weight of what was to come. The shadowy figure ahead seemed to remain perfectly still, its outline barely distinguishable from the haze of the horizon. It wasn't like the Watcher. No, this presence felt older, more primal, something that had been lurking in the corners of time, waiting for the right moment to step forward. With every step Sarah took, she felt the shadows pull at her, trying to weaken her resolve, trying to make her doubt herself. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, urging her to turn away, to flee. "You can fight what's already inside you," the voice whispered, not from any single direction, but everywhere, inside her mind. "The darkness is within you. It always has been." She clenched her jaw, refusing to let the fear take hold. She had faced the darkness in the form of the Watcher, but this was different. This wasn't a single entity. It was the very essence of fear, of doubt, of everything she had fought to overcome. "You're afraid," the voice taunted, growing louder. "Afraid of what you are, afraid of the power that you carry, afraid of facing the truth." Her thoughts began to cloud with doubt, the words gnawing at the edges of her mind. But Sarah refused to stop. She had faced her fears before. She had looked into the darkness and survived. "No," she whispered to herself. "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Not again. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, but with every step Sarah took, the light from the feather in her hand grew brighter. It pulsed, steady and strong, a constant reminder of the power she had within gnawing. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned that fear was not something to avoid. It was something to face, something to control. As she closed the distance between herself and the figure, it began to take shape. A tall, slender form, cloaked in dark robes that billowed around it like smoke. Its face remained obscured by the hood, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her. The air itself seemed to bend and shift around it, as though it were not entirely part of this world. The figure were not entirely a part of this world, lifted its hand, and the shadows around them thickened, swirling in the air, as if the darkness itself was coming alive. But Sarah didn't back down. She held the feather high, focusing on the light that radiated from it.
I want run from
"You," Sarah said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you." The figure's form flickered, its mouth stretching into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you have the strength to fight me?" it asked, its voice a deep, rumbling sound. "You think you can face the darkness inside you and win?" Sarah stood her ground. She didn't know who, or what, this figure was, but she knew one thing for sure. It was not the end. It was another chapter in her journey, another fight she had to win. "I faced the darkness before," Sarah said, feeling the light from the feather surge through her veins. "And I'll face it again. I don't fear you. I don't fear what you represent." The figure's smile faded, replaced with a look of disdain. "You cannot escape your true nature. It cannot escape your true nature," hissed. "You are part of the darkness. It will always be a part of you. It feeds on your fear, your doubt, your every weakness, and no matter how hard you fight, it will always return." Sarah's hand tightened around the feather, feel the warmth and energy flowing from it. But she could also feel the strain. The feather wasn't invincible. and neither was she. But she didn't need to be invincible. She just needed to keep fighting with a determined breath. Sarah raised the feather high above her head, and the light exploded outward in a brilliant wave, cutting through the shadows and the cold air around her. The darkness recoiled, retreating momentarily, as if the very light itself had burned it. The figure's form flickered, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she had won, but then the ground beneath her feet trembled again, the air growing thick with pressure. The figure's form solidified once more, and it stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an intense, unearthly light. "You can push me back, yes," the figure said, its voice low and mocking. "But the darkness will always return. It will always find a way to bring you down. You can never be free from it." Sarah's chest tightened. The words stung, but she refused to let them break her resolve. The light from the feather was strong, but she knew she had to do more. She had to reach deeper, tap into something even stronger than the light, and then it hit her. The truth she had been avoiding, the realization she had tried to suppress for so long. She wasn't just fighting against the darkness outside of her. She was fighting the darkness within herself. The fears, the doubts, the parts of her she had run from her entire life. She couldn't defeat it until she accepted it. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on the flickering light in her chest. She let it grow, let it expand, until it filled her entire body. The feather was just a sleep-gent, anti-DKS, Sprintstyle tool. The real power was within her all along. The fear, the darkness, it was part of her, but it didn't have to control her. She reached out, not just with the feather, but with her whole being, and the light surged forth, brighter than before, filling the space around her. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently as the light poured into it, tearing at the shadows that had once been so strong. The darkness twisted and writhed, unable to withstand the power of Sarah's resolve. "No!" The figure hissed, its form dissolving, its voice fading into nothingness. "This isn't over." But before it could finish, it was gone, vanished into the light. The air around Sarah lightened, and the trembling ground steadied. The darkness had been pushed back, but she knew it would return. It always did. But now, she knew she could face it. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. Not of the shadows, not of the fear inside her, and not of the darkness that threatened to consume everything. She had become the light, and nothing, no darkness, could take that away from her. Sarah stood alone, the ground still trembling beneath her feet, but she felt the weight of the battle lifting from her shoulders. The air had grown lighter, and the overwhelming presence of darkness that had once haunted her every step was gone. For now, but this time, Sarah wasn't fooled. She knew that the darkness, in whatever form it would return, was always shielding veil with enchantment. In return, was always lurking just beneath the surface. Yet, as the light from the feather dimmed, and the remnants of the figure that had once stood before her vanished, Sarah didn't feel fear. Instead, she felt a sense of quiet resolve. She had faced the darkness inside and out, and no matter what came next, she would be ready. Her fingers loosened around the feather, its once vibrant glow now fading into a soft, steady light that was still enough to comfort her. Sarah looked up at the sky, watching the first rays of dawn break through the clouds, scattering the remaining shadows that had clung to the world. The battle had been fierce, and she had lost much along the way. But she had emerged stronger, not just in power, but in spirit, and anger, but in spirit. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She knew that her journey would never truly end, that the darkness would return, in different shapes and forms, just as it always had. But she would be ready. She had learned that light was not something you waited for. It was something you had to create within yourself. With one final glance at the horizon, Sarah turned and walked away from the ruins of the battle, the soft light of the rising sun guiding her steps. She had faced her fears, and now she could finally embrace the freedom she had fought for. The world around her was still, the quiet peace enveloping her as the first birdsong filled the air. And with that, Sarah stepped forward. Journey continuing, but no longer in fear. The end.